Hello and welcome. I'm Rachel Kahn, and this is the session, What do the Jewish people really want to be in the 21st century? What's their mission? I think of all the ancient traditions, the Jewish people in the modern era has been the most consistent in asking itself questions about its future. And this has been because they, more than any other faith group, has been buffeted by the currents of history, whether it was as a response to the challenge of the Enlightenment or the emancipation of its European communities, or to the rise of nationalist movements, which by definition excluded them, or to the rise of the anti-religious movement of communism, or to the emergence of its own nationalist movement, or to the mass murder of the majority of its European population in the Holocaust, or the return to its ancient homeland, or finally to the continuing rejection of Israel by the Muslim world and now by large parts of the Western world. All these currents of history have prompted survival strategies and not a little ingenuity and creativity. But not all of the challenges to the Jewish people have been negative ones. The Enlightenment produced its own Jewish version, the Haskalah. The emancipation from civil disabilities was a welcome liberation to a large part of the Jewish people. The feminist movement released women from their circumscribed and tradition-bound roles and unleashed a great store of talent and passion into Jewish life that was denied for centuries. Sadly, their contribution is not represented by the speakers on this panel, an oversight that is really hardly imaginable at a parliament of the world's religions which has as one of its themes the plight of women. Indeed, were it not for my own protests, the panel would not even have heard from the reform wing of Judaism, which I do not need to remind this audience makes up the largest number of Jews in the world today. However, we do have with us 4 eminent rabbis, each of whom work in different capacities in the Jewish community and beyond. And I'm sure we are all extremely interested in what they have to say about the future of the Jewish people. I'd like to begin with, first let me give a brief introduction. Rabbi David Rosen, the former Chief Rabbi of Ireland, has been the leading Jewish proponent of interreligious understanding at the highest levels. He's helped to promote the positive revolution in church teaching about the Jews and has occupied the most important international positions in fostering dialogue. Rabbi Jeremy Lawrence is the senior rabbi at the Great Synagogue in Sydney and serves as a registrar and judge on the Sydney Beit Din and holds advisory positions representing Orthodox Jewry on communal organizations of New South Wales. Rabbi David Saperstein is our rabbi on the Hill, Capitol Hill, of course. And for Jews who are a minority in the world, a much smaller minority than many people realize, his influence with Barack Obama is of great value for us, we hope. Rabbi Saperstein represents the National Reform Jewish Movement to Congress and is the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. Finally, Rabbi Brad Hirschfeld is an interfaith activist described by Newsweek as one of America's most influential rabbis. He's the creator of Building Bridges and American Pilgrimage on Bridges TV, and is the author of a book I've been reading called You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right. He's the president of CLAL, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. Well, let us first hear from Rabbi David Rosen about what you think the mission of the Jewish people ought to be in the 21st century.
Thank you, Rachel. I regret that I'm the first to go. I was hoping, of course, to be the last so that I would get wisdom from my colleagues. But I, too, lament the absence of women. I'm very surprised that the intention was only to have Orthodox rabbis on this. If that was the case, then it would have only been Jeremy and me. And I actually thought that this whole program was the brainwave of Rabbi Brad. So something very strange happened on the way to the forum somewhere along the way. But if the question is what the Jewish people wants to be, then of course there's no one answer. there's also not 13 million answers, because if you have two Jews, you have three opinions, as you all are aware. But in terms, if we try to address what is the major challenge, and I would just try to allude to one point, but albeit a somewhat tortured point, what has identified us, or what has allowed us to have a sense of collective identity in the past, has been a sense of common history, of common destiny, and of a shared way of life and the values that come from that shared way of life. In this day and age, I'm not sure that the latter, the last of these, is any more the source of cohesion amongst the Jewish people. It is even commonplace now in terms of conferences, academic conferences, to talk of Judaisms, and that's probably a fair reflection. And therefore there are very significant components within this collective, which we still now have to define in that context, that see themselves as detached from other parts in terms of their way of life and in terms even of their value system. So what we're left with, therefore, is a shared history and a shared destiny. In that regard, of course, we are still living under the impact of the two most shattering events, both for worse and for better, in the history of the Jewish people, arguably in the last 2,000 years, certainly at least in terms of historic memory. And they are the tragedy of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and the enormity of the transformation in the Jewish condition through the establishment of the State of Israel and the rebirth of Jewish sovereignty in our ancestral homeland. These have been the two, if you like, leitmotifs in terms of Jewish life and existence, and they have in certain respects brought disparate elements together. Certainly the impact of the Shoah has been felt across the board. However, if the truth be told, as much as, especially in America, they've tried to make this the civil religion, which binds together the Jewish community, and despite the valiant attempts to preserve the memory of the Shoah can evidently no longer serve as the galvanizing force between collective Jewish identity. It is hardly a turn-on for the younger generation, and it's not what keeps them connected, despite the frustration and as much as this may anger their parent and grandparent generation. And quite honestly, I have a lot of sympathy for that. Of course, I don't want people to forget the tragedy of the Shoah. I don't want them to understand its universal implications as well as its particular significance. But any identity that is nurtured by a sense of victimhood in the final analysis is an unhealthy identity. And there are far too many of our own co-religionists whose identity is nurtured by a sense of victimhood. Israel is the most mind-boggling transformation in the condition of the Jewish people. And the amazing thing about it is that in terms of its history, Zionism was opposed on both poles, by the most liberal segments in the Jewish community and by the most ultra-Orthodox. Today, I believe it's fair to say that there is not one single component in Jewish life that defines itself despite Israel. And if they do still exist, and probably we do still need to acknowledge that Neturei Karta and Ahmadinejad's friends with long side locks and black hats are around, but in a very trivial number, they are nevertheless totally marginal to the collective of the Jewish people as a whole, and even marginal to ultra-Orthodoxy. So across the board, people define themselves today in some way in relation to Israel. And therefore, for better or for worse, maybe there are those that think it is for worse, but the reality is that the glue that binds the Jewish people today together is Israel. I would even go so far, and as I'm an Israeli, obviously I feel very strongly, I have a particular viewpoint that my colleagues here, who are all leading diaspora rabbis, may not share. I do not believe that diaspora Jewry would ultimately survive the destruction of Israel. There would be various kinds of communities that would emerge and develop, but the cohesion that would bring them together as a collective of the Jewish people would have disappeared. And this places an enormous responsibility on Israel. A responsibility which I don't even think Israel understands as a collective, and its leadership, certainly with a kind of poor quality political leadership with which we have been cursed and continue to be cursed, certainly is unlikely to grasp the enormity of that. But thank God we survived despite our political leadership. One of the greatest testimonies that there is something divine in the very reality of this re-establishment of our independent life. But this now raises very heavy challenges. And especially in recent times, young people's ability in different parts of the world to identify with Israel is sorely tested. And that is why, to cut a long story short, because I'm actually taking longer than I thought, to cut a long story short, peace for Israel is not only an imperative for the survival of its own society, it's not only an imperative for the dignity and the national aspirations of the Palestinians. It's not only an imperative to be able to break through the hostility in the Muslim world towards Israel and Jewish people. It's not only essential in order to address the Islamic-West relationship. It's not only has ramifications with regards to global security, but ultimately it has critical ramifications with regards to Judaism itself. Because if Judaism itself is ultimately defined or influenced by a society that is in conflict and at war and has to be a fortress that by definition becomes insular and self-protective and loses its universal and its global responsibility and message, then the whole relationship of Jews everywhere gets distorted. Values get perverted everywhere. And therefore the challenge of peace so that Israel can be what it really sought to be in terms of reflecting the values that come from our prophetic tradition and heritage, enable the Jewish people to flourish not only in terms of its particularity but in terms of its universality. This is the crucial issue that has bearing for Jews everywhere. And it will determine the face of the Jewish people in the future, and as a result relationships between Jews and Christians and Muslims, and as a result between Islam and the West. And once again this tiny little people that is so insignificant numerically is forced to the very pivot, to the center, to the belly button of global conflict and interaction. Once upon a time it was geographical, because all the nations, all the global empires had to cross this little piece of land if they wanted to access one empire or one continent to another. Now it is because we are at the cutting edge of the interaction between civilizations. And whether we like it or not, we're right at the center. And what we do has ramifications way beyond our understanding of how it pertains to us. So this challenge is of enormous significance. So bottom line is, finding a way to resolve this conflict, breaking out of the cycle of violence in the Middle East, is of critical consequence in determining who we are and who we will be. And this requires us to galvanize every single relationship and avenue and opportunity in order to build bridges, to be able to give new opportunities, to forge new horizons, and especially to offer hope both within the Jewish people and for all those connected and interacting with it. Thank you.
Rabbi Rosen, can I just ask you one or two questions on that? You said at the beginning that an identity based on victimhood, particularly the Holocaust, is not a good foundation for Jewish identity. But it is also true that victimhood and a sense of being persecuted and always on the defensive is also associated with a strong support of Israel. How does the Jewish identity overcome that sense of victimhood, which is a natural outcome of a country at conflict and at war?
Well, thank you very much, because obviously my brevity was at the expense of clarity, because I thought I was addressing that, and I obviously wasn't. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. My point is that if this sense of victimhood or vulnerability or sense of discrimination is the only impulse motivating Jewish life, then I'll say something even more dramatic than what I said before. I don't want it. So Jean-Paul Sartre's definition of an authentic Jew for me is simply a condemnation and a rejection of everything that I understand Judaism to be. If Judaism is not a life as our sages, as indeed Scripture describes it, of a tree of life, a living, vital, vibrant, dynamic, beautiful, exciting, wonderful way of life to live, then why the hell should people have to have that cross to bear, if you'll excuse me mixing my metaphors? So therefore, here comes the challenge. The challenge, of course, is on people like us to make sure that our communities understand, can perceive its vibrancy and its beauty, and can experience that. But that, nevertheless, today has to be related, in terms of the cohesion and the collective identity of the Jewish people, also to what Israel is. And therefore, if Israel is not a place that is seen as it is, as a culturally dynamic, innovative, technologically advanced society that's got beauty and dynamism, but also manifests the values of its heritage and a way of life that is exciting and diverse, yes, with various forms of its expression. All these things are limited at the moment by the fact that we are a society at war. All the diversity, all the potentiality of the Jewish people is not expressed because we are a society in conflict. All civil issues are put to the back burner, and the only issue that we address is the issue of, do we make territorial compromise? Don't we make territorial compromise if we're going to move ahead? How are we going to move ahead? All the other issues are disregarded. The result is that Israel, to some extent, is caught in a state of suspended animation. And the creativity and the diversity that is within it is not fully appreciated in the world. I, as you have heard, am very much involved in interfaith relations. There's an umbrella organization for interfaith work in Israel called the ICCI, which embraces over 70 organizations, working in relations between Christians, Muslims, Jews, Druze, Baha'i. There are well over 150 organizations of Jewish-Arab cooperation in Israel. The vast majority of Jews, let alone of the rest of the world, have never heard of these activities. They don't know about them. They don't know of the music, of the art, of the cultural vitality, of all the innovation that takes place within our society. They don't know of the religious diversity. They don't know of the religious creativity. They don't know of the sources. They have monochromatic perspectives of all these things, almost entirely determined by politics. If you go around and you look for them to find out names of rabbis, for example, the rabbis they will be able to identify are those related to politics. Almost anything that has any significance in terms of diaspora perception is somehow related to politics. Even Jews don't appreciate the potentiality that there is within Israel, let alone the rest of the world. And therefore, what I'm saying is that we have to break this bottleneck. And we can only break this bottleneck through political breakthrough. When there is political breakthrough, all this diversity has the opportunity to relate to people in different places of the world with creativity, to make Israel a new reality, to make people understand that simply rallying Pavlov-like to any possible assault on Israel's well-being is not what it means to be a Jew. There's more to a Jew than simply rallying around a flag. And that diversity and that beauty and that opportunity will only come about through a breakthrough. But if that identity is simply preserved because Israel is threatened, and because there are people that hate us, and there are people that hate us, and Israel is threatened, and it is at risk, and it is right that people should support Israel to be able to protect itself, nevertheless, that kind of identity is not self-sustaining. It's not something you will be able to pass on to future generations. And therefore, if we don't break through that bottleneck, I'm not optimistic at all about our future. But because I am optimistic about our future, I'm confident that that bottleneck is going to be broken.
Thank you. I hope I'll get a chance to ask you a few more questions, and certainly the one about shared Jewish history, which I think with the establishment of the State of Israel sometimes has challenged that sense of a common history as the diaspora has gone its own direction and a gulf has grown there. But I think we should pass on to Rabbi Jeremy Lawrence. I'd like to hear from you about the issues you think Jews should be conscious of in the 21st century to ensure their future.
Thanks, Rachel. It's interesting that Rabbi Rosen said that the most identified rabbis are political characters. I actually think I'm sitting between two of the most identifiable rabbis in the world, both of them Davids, both of them highly acclaimed, and inasmuch as politics is about dealing with people, The very fact that these are rabbis who are people rabbis, who deal with people issues, I think gives truth to David Rosen's statement, but actually isn't the way he intended to mean it in the beginning. I'd like to disagree with him. I'm also an Israeli. I made Aliyah when I got married, when I was studying in Israel, because I believed that it was important to articulate a Judaism in diaspora, and I saw my time in diaspora as a temporary one. It's been a very long temporary one, just like the exile from Jerusalem had been a long temporary one for the Jewish world. But for me, it was very important to be identified as an Israeli, and it's important for me that I will serve, can serve, and my children should serve in the defense of our people at its most extreme. I became a passionate Zionist in my youth through youth organizations. I grew up in an Orthodox family, but not a particularly observant one. I was committed to saving Jews on campus whose Jewish societies were being destroyed because they were being closed down because they were Zionist ones. And it was in that capacity as an officer of the Union of Jewish Students that I came to Israel in 1984, and there was a participant in a seminar run by Rabbi David Rosen. And I was a Verbrennter Zionist, passionate for Soviet Jewry, passionate for the defense of our people. And David did something to me which changed my life. He introduced me to two things: Jewish texts and vegetarianism. He won on one score. Right, I've got it. My daughter is a vegetarian. She's on your side. The transition to texts, which led to me becoming a rabbi. So if you like what I say, blame him. If you don't like what I say, blame the fact that I still eat meat. The transition to text was on the basis that Jewish education was important. That there was no point fighting for the Jews in the Soviet Union to be free without being free to do something. One can fight for every person to be free. We should fight for the freedom of every individual. But as a Jewish campaign for Jewish rights, it was somewhat weird that I was campaigning for people to pray, to read, to study, when I had no real background in any of that myself. And David was one of the people who introduced me to the beauty of Jewish texts, and that transformed my life and transformed the direction that I took. There's a story of a little girl, Amy, who was sitting in Sunday school, and the teacher had them drawing pictures and came up and said, "Amy, that's really wonderful. What is it you're drawing? Is that is that your mummy?" And she said, "No, it's not my mummy. Is that orange circle the sun?" Amy says, "No, it isn't the sun." So, "Amy, what is it you're drawing?" And Amy looks up at Mrs. Goldstein and says, "I'm drawing God." Mrs. Goldstein looks down at her and says, "How can you be drawing God? Nobody knows what he looks like." And Amy turns around and says, "Ah, but they will when they look at my picture." The people around me today are pictures of God. And whether it's the people with whom I am more aligned or less aligned religiously, or if it's the people across the room here who are interested in Judaism, or the people who are attending whatever the Muslims, Christians, the Hindus, Buddhists, and everybody else in this world are concerned about, we are all of us fundamentally in the image of God. And Judaism believes that Jewish texts teach people to see the godliness in everyone and to enable us to paint a divine picture, to enable us to civilize, settle, and improve the world. And I suppose I wouldn't be a rabbi unless I believed that the Jewish message coming from the text which David first taught me wouldn't lead to a better world. We have different pictures. Certainly for me, the Orthodox way is the tradition which I believe is the critical one to pass on to my children and my family. And to that extent, for me, it is a right way. And within my understanding of the integrity of Judaism, there is some diversity that is acceptable within Orthodoxy, but other things become problematic. But it becomes incredibly difficult in the Jewish world at the point where we say those problems sever us from seeing the true humanity and godliness in each individual. certainly a Jewish community which has experienced persecution, whether they observe the Sabbath or don't, whether they observe it in an orthodox way or don't, whether they are religious or secular, whether their parents were born Jewish or converted Jewish under this system or that, the persecution feels the same and hurts the same and leads to the same extinction of life. And as a Jewish community, it is a paramount concern to me that the things which unify us and define us and our togetherness are the first things which we choose to amplify in looking to create a Jewish future within the world. Within the Orthodox world itself, I've got a real problem. And I think it's a greater problem than the one between Orthodoxy and Reform in its own way. I represent a strand of modern Orthodoxy which believes in the integration of secular study and religious values and sees the benefits which both can bring to the world. I'm a sort of well-integrated Jew, a fundamentalist in normal clothing. But when I look, and Rachel talked about the majority of the Jewish world being non-Orthodox, which may be statistically correct today, within the demographics of the Jewish world, as we see them growing, the growth in the ultra-Orthodox movements, the number of children, therefore grandchildren and great-grandchildren they are having, is far outstripping the mainstream Jewish growth within modern Orthodoxy, and certainly within the progressive and reform movements in their different colors. And therefore I see a worrying future with an increasing majority tending towards a rejectionist theocracy. And I think that the continuing encouragement of a centrist Judaism is personally one of my greatest fears. How do we guarantee that? How do we keep the birth rate up and the fundamentalism down? How do we maintain the internal polarization? I'm worried about the differentiation, and it is lamentable that there is no woman, and indeed no woman rabbi, on this panel. I think that the differences in attitudes between the centrist and modern Orthodox perspectives, where I believe in some capacity we will be seeing women called rabbis soon, and at the ultra-right is a polarization which worries me. Will my converts be acceptable to them to marry? Will our Judaism remain its homogeneity simply because we keep the same Shabbat, we keep the same Kashrut? We are so closely aligned on so many areas, but our attitudes towards women are an area of distinction. In our Parshiot over the last couple of weeks, we've read the story of Noah and the story of Babel. We're told that Noah was given his name because he was going to bring comfort to the world, and the Midrash says he looked at a world which was cursed by God, and a world which was rough and difficult as the punishment to Adam and Eve, and according to tradition he invented the plow and the ability to develop and nurture and tend the world, and the world stopped being cursed. We live in a world at the moment where we look at a world and we are worried for what is happening to it. We're worried about the environment. We're worried about a cursed world where people live unable to tend to crops to support themselves, where people do not have the resources they want. And as David Saperstein said in his most inspirational address at the plenum, it's not a problem we can't overcome. We just need to have the moral vision and the political will. I think those were your words, David. We can make our world a better world, and we are a Noah generation. We are looking at flooding, we're looking at destructions of animals, we're looking at a destruction of humanity around us. And Jewishly, if we have a mission, it's the one that was given to Adam in his time, and it was given to Noah in his time, which was to civilize the world, to save the world, to tend to the garden and to preserve it. And this idea of tikkun olam is one which the Reform movement embraced at the earliest period, and Orthodoxy, even though it was always a core part of our teaching, seems to have shied away from these critical ideas. But unless we begin to have a world view, which looks to the betterment of all of humanity, then Judaism is actually missing its overarching civilizing message, which is to bring God's light to the world. If God has a light, it is that his presence exists in all of us, and his world is an inheritance for all of us. And in each of us, in our different ways, we have the responsibility to make that light shine through so that all of us can look to a better future. And that is our mission.